Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the phrase model. This is also sometimes known as tonal areas. So sometimes when you're taking a graduate exam or you're reading another textbook, they may not refer to the phrase model. They may refer to the actual tonal areas that make up this concept known as the phrase model. So we're going to get into the phrase model today, and I'm going to briefly introduce you to it. And then as this course continues, we're going to look at a lot of musical examples to help you better understanding how to actually apply the phrase model and use it in your own analysis. So the first thing you need to know, the basic phrase. Phrases need to have two parts. You need to pay attention to the melody and how it rises and falls, and you need to pay attention to the cadence. So the melodic content is going to be really important for helping you to figure out where the cadence actually occurs. You can't just go through in most pieces and do a harmonic analysis and then figure out where the cadence is. You may have several 5-1 progressions, so that would be scale degree 5, a triad built on the 5th scale degree, moving to scale degree 1, triad built on the 1st scale degree. You may have several of those throughout the piece, but they're not cadences. They're just serving to embellish or expand one of the tonal areas in a piece. So it's really important that when you're trying to analyze a piece, you also look at what's going on in the melody so you can get a better context and idea of where the actual cadence is. So phrases can end two basic ways. You can end with a conclusive cadence, and that's going to be where it sounds really complete. Or you could end with an inconclusive cadence. An inconclusive cadence is going to sound less complete. It'll still sound like the phrase has kind of come to an end because a melody will indicate that, but it will feel like it's not yet finished, and that it has to go on to a second phrase to continue the idea that was started in the first one. So as you can imagine, we typically use these conclusive phrases to end a piece. And we use inconclusive phrases to create that forward motion and propel the listener from the first phrase to the second phrase and so on. So the way you can identify these is our conclusive cadence will generally end with scale degree 1 in the soprano. So that means if you're in the key of C, you're going to have a C in the soprano. And they also tend to use stepwise motion into that C. So you're either going to have a B, which would be the leading tone, moving into C, which would be the tonic, or you're going to have a D moving down into the tonic. Either way, it needs to move by step for it to sound really conclusive. The other part of a conclusive cadence is that you need to have this bass motion where you have scale degrees 5 and 1 in the bass. So what will end up happening is if you build a chord on the 5th scale degree, let's just use C major. Here's C. Here's your G. So if I build a chord on that G, G, B, and D, I now have a dominant triad, or a chord built on the 5th scale degree. The chord that this needs to resolve to is the 1 chord, so the chord built on C. So that would be C, E, and G. In order to make this sound conclusive, what we do is we have our 5 chord here, and then we just need to resolve it in a way where you have C in the top voice. This is sort of the first part. You can see how that kind of sounds complete, but it's not yet done yet. We need to add the 4th voice. We need to add the bass. So here's my 5 chord, and then I'm going to play that same upper 3 voices, but I'm going to put scale degree 1 in the bass so it sounds really conclusive. So listen to what it sounds like. See how powerful that sounds? So that's a really conclusive cadence. It's actually arguably the most conclusive cadence you can have in classical romantic music. An inconclusive cadence isn't going to have scale degree 1 in the soprano, or it might not have scale degrees 5 and 1 in the bass. And there's a lot of different types of inconclusive cadences. So let me play that one progression for you one more time. Here's your 5 chord. So that would be conclusive. If I don't put scale degree 1 in the soprano, if I revoice it a different way, it just sounds a little less conclusive, right? So one of the things we want to do at the end of a piece especially is to use primarily conclusive cadences, unless you're really going for this idea where you want kind of an ambiguous ending. So if the bass moves from scale degrees 5 to 1, but the soprano does not end on 1 like the chord progression I just played, we consider the phrase to be less conclusive. An inconclusive cadence means generally the final chord is not 1. It could be a half cadence, a septive cadence, or some other indefinite sounding cadence. Now at this point, we haven't talked about the half cadence, the septive cadence, or any of the other cadences you're going to learn about. So for now, just know that anything that doesn't have 5, the dominant chord, and 1, the tonic chord, as the final 2 chords in a progression, any progression that doesn't have that 5-1 relationship is going to be inconclusive. And that's kind of a good way to start this, and we'll add more cadences as we go. So another point to sort of note here is that multiple phrases in a piece, they tend to consist of equal durations and are usually 2, 4, or 8 measures long in the classical period. Now there's actually a theory that actually all classical phrases are just 4 measures long, which is something that we get into much later. It's a difference between what you see notated on the page and what we hear. So some theorists argue that we mostly hear 4-bar phrases, even if the score will notate them as a 2-bar phrase or an 8-bar phrase. And that's something that you can just kind of start to think about, because it's something we're going to get into in a lot more detail later. So when you're analyzing the structure of a work, it's possible to complete a 2-layer analysis. So in the 2 layers, you've got your first layer, and that's just a harmonic analysis and consists of Roman numerals and Romanettes. So like we learned about, each scale degree has its own Roman numeral. Depending on whether it's major or minor, you need to use a Roman numeral or a Romanette. So what you do first is you just go through and you try and analyze as many chords as you can. What I suggest is if you come across a chord that's confusing or you're not certain on, maybe just put a line underneath that chord and come back to it later, because what will often happen is once you get the really obvious chords, then some of the other chords start to fall into place. And the other thing is that in the beginning stages, you're not always going to know what's common. So you're not really going to understand how chords progress. So you might not make the best decisions for some of these more obscure chords. But with time and practice, and you complete this entire series, you'll have a better understanding of how to actually analyze a piece of music. So that's the first layer. It's just a harmonic analysis using Roman numerals or Romanettes. The second level, we put this underneath the Roman numerals. This is a much broader concept, and it just identifies the contextual analysis and highlights important tonal areas. So at this point, you only have 3 tonal areas I'm going to talk about. You've got the tonic area. That's how a piece starts. That's how a phrase starts. It always, in the classical romantic period, starts with a tonic area. The second area would be the dominant area. This is typically your 5 chord in your 5-1 cadence. And then your tonic closure comes really quickly after that dominant area, and that's just a tonic chord that ends the phrase. So I'm actually going to show you an example of this. So here's an example of a contextual analysis. You'll notice that what I've done is I've written the key underneath the clef. So you see that uppercase C? That indicates we are in C major. If you then look at the chord, I used a Roman numeral 1 to indicate that we're dealing with a C major chord because we just have the notes C, E, and G. The second measure, it stays the same, so I didn't label the 1 chord again because it's just superfluous. It's kind of unnecessary. If we go to the third measure, we have a 5 chord. You've got the notes G, B, and D. That 5 chord is a half note, and then it just comes down and revoices a little bit an octave lower in the bass so that it can create this nice perfect fourth motion into the final 1 chord in the last measure. So you see the 1, 5, 1 Roman numerals. Underneath that, I've also identified these as tonal areas as part of the phrase model. So I put a T under that first one chord that starts the phrase. I then draw a line all the way over. I'm going to use my highlighter. This line goes all the way over to the dominant area. Now, since there are two chords here, we can say the dominant area has been expanded because this is a slight variation. Theorists might vary on whether or not they want to use a simple revoicing of the 5 chord as sort of an embellishment or an expansion of this dominant chord. But for our purposes, since the chord is changing the voicing, we're just going to draw a line all the way through to indicate that this is a dominant area. It's where you get your dominant chord and then a little bit of an expansion before the final tonic closure, the final 1 chord. So the way you label this, just a T, a line, you write a D here, another line, and then T. If there's a single chord without any expansion, then what you do is you still draw this T to indicate the 1 chord, or this first half of the melody is being expanded. Then you write a 5. Since there's no change in chord, I don't draw a line between the dominant area and the tonic closure. So technically this is just a dominant. It's not really an area at all. And then it just comes down to the tonic closure. So you can do this with most classical pieces. You can go through and you can actually analyze the phrase model. So as a performer, this helps you because it teaches you what to expect in terms of the phrase. And it helps to reinforce your natural understanding and your intuitive understanding of how to phrase a melody. It gives you something really solid that you can rely upon. So the basic process, first, you want to complete a Roman numeral analysis. That's stage 1. Then you write T below the opening tonic chord like you saw in the previous slide. Don't include the dominant anacrusis under the T label if there is one. So if there's a pickup into the first chord, so maybe it spells out a 5 chord and then it goes to the tonic on the downbeat, we don't label that dominant anacrusis. It's not necessary because that dominant is sort of extra. It prepares for the opening of the phrase model. It's not actually something that is part of the the tonic area. So then you label the 5/1 cadence using D to T. Use D only, so if you don't have a final 1 chord, you would just use the D and leave it at that, and that would indicate you're actually dealing with a half cadence. So real quick, how do you know what a half cadence is? A half cadence is anything that ends on 5. So it could be a 6 chord going to a 5. It could be a 4/6 going to a 5. It could be a 2 going to a 5. If the phrase ends on a 5 chord instead of a 1 chord, we call that a half cadence, and that would be an example of an inconclusive cadence. It doesn't really indicate the end of the piece, and it doesn't conclusively end the phrase. So as long as the tonic and dominant area continues for more than 1 beat or measure, just draw a line to indicate the continuation of the area. It's going to be somewhat subjective, but typically you can look at the melody, the chords, the harmonic rhythm. You can look at all these different features to determine whether or not there's a continuation or a static harmony in the piece. So in tonal music, it's common to establish the tonal area clearly, so the tonic area. We can accomplish this in a number of ways. We can repeat the tonic triad using variation to keep it interesting. So you could have a C chord. You could then play it in first inversion. Very uncommonly, you might go to a 6/4 chord. But these are all just basically 1 chords, revoiced in different ways. Right? That's one way to keep that tonic area just a little more interesting. You can expand it. You can use both root position and inverted tonic triads, like what I just did there. And you can use embellishing tones to move between chord members. So let's say I want to go from a root position 1 chord to this first inversion. One of the things you could do is in the bass, maybe move up by a step, and then you just move into that third in the bass. So you can use passing tones and embellishing tones to actually move between chord members. We're going to talk about embellishing tones later. For now, just kind of put a pin in this and remember that there's this concept known as embellishing tones. They're tones that don't fit the chord. So if you have a C major chord and then you have an E major chord, you got the notes C, E, and G for the C major, E, G, and B for the E minor chord. If you then put in a D in between these two chords, that D doesn't fit either the C or the E chord. So we call that an embellishing tone because it's not actually analyzed as part of the chord progression. And this is something that's going to make a lot more sense as we continue, because I'm going to show you a lot of examples of it. At this point, the most important thing is that you're just kind of getting an idea that there's a tonic area in music, in classical and romantic period at least, and we can embellish it in various ways. The most common and simplest method would be just repeating that tonic triad using inversions and variation to keep it interesting. So I'm going to show you one way that you can actually expand a tonic area using just a one chord. So here we have that same basic chord progression that I had in previous measures. Now you'll notice a one chord should have the notes C, E, and G. So here's a C, here's a G, here's a G, E, C, 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 E. So every single one of these notes is actually part of the underlying chord. This is one way to create interest and to create a more interesting melody. But it doesn't create any dissonance at all. It's actually very harmonically stable because every single one of these notes fits the underlying C major harmony. And that is one way to do this, and is perfectly legitimate. If you look at the 5 chord, you've got a G, a B, and a D. And only G, B, and D are used in this measure. So this is an example of how you can actually break apart these chords to create more interesting melodic lines. This is a lot more interesting than simply playing blocked chords. And this is something that a lot of beginning composers will fail to do. They'll just create these nice block harmonies, but they fail to take advantage of these multiple independent lines they can create simply by breaking up these triads. So if we look at the second example, here we're using embellishing tones, and this is a better example of what an actual embellishing tone is. So you've still got a C major triad here. Notice on the strong beats, you got a C, C, E, that's kind of a weak beat, but it's still part of the chord. Then you have another E and another C. There's 2 chord tones that don't fit. The B here does not fit a C major harmony, but notice how it's moving by step and moving away by step. So it's moving from a consonant note here to a dissonant note here. So if I play this, you hear how that's dissonant. Same with the D. So you can hear that there's certain non-chord tones that have been inserted in between the chord tones. So I basically took something similar to this concept up here, where you have a basic arpeggiation of the underlying harmony with no dissonance, and then I just added some passing tones to create a little more forward momentum, because anytime you have a dissonance, it wants to resolve. So we have this C that comes down to the leading tone B, and then that B wants to come back up to the C. So I take it back up to the C, and now it's consonant again. And then on the next offbeat, we have another dissonance. So this is another non-chord tone or embellishing tone. And we do this throughout the piece. So we have a B and a D. Those are non-chord tones. The F is a non-chord tone. Here with the 5 chord, this C is a non-chord tone. So you can see how we can use these non-chord tones to create interest. One of the things you'll notice is every time I use a non-chord tone, I approach and leave it by step. This is the most typical way of resolving any dissonance, is moving by step. That's something called voice leading, and it's really important at this stage. Later, when you get into modern music and we talk about some of those concepts, you will be able to understand when and why you need to break these basic voice leading principles. But I think it's very important to learn the core information first before expanding into more complex ideas. Like, understand where music came from before you start trying to break the rules and create something new. It'll just help you create more interesting music, and music that is actually infused with some understanding of centuries worth of development. You don't want to just ignore everything Beethoven did in his lifetime, or Mozart, or Ruth Crawford Seeger. She was a 20th century composer, or Nadia Boulanger, or Lydia Boulanger, her sister. So there's all these different composers you can learn from. But it's really going to be important that you learn the basics before you start to get into, well, why did things change? Why do we have more dissonant music now? Those are big questions which we will attempt to answer throughout this very long series. Okay, so expanding the tonic area with dominance. This is another way you can expand that tonic area. You don't have to use just tonic triads. And you can use chords other than the dominant as well. The tonic triad is going to be required at the very beginning of the phrase to firmly establish the home key. But once you do that, you can start using other chords. And you can kind of get a little bit more creative. So there are other chords you can use to expand the tonic area and make your melodies a little more interesting. Some of the most common chords would be the 5 chord, the 4 chord, the 2 chord, and the 6 chord. The 3 chord isn't used very commonly. You're also not going to see 6/4 chords, so chords in second inversion, very often. If you see a 3 chord or a 6/4 chord, I'm just going to tell you now, you should look very carefully at what's going on in the music, because there's probably a very specific technique being used if there's a 6/4 or a 3 chord. They're not typically used in classical music. The 3 chords are not really used because it's ambiguous. It really doesn't have a lot of pull either way. It shares 2 chord tones with a 1 chord, and it just seems out of place in most contexts unless it's used in a very particular way. And then the 6/4 chords, which is where you have a chord with a 5th in the bass, they're just so unstable. They don't really imply tonality. So they have to be used in a way, or at least they're traditionally used in a way that allows them to resolve properly. So it creates forward motion by using them. But they're always used in a particular way, which we'll get into pretty shortly, actually. So harmonies can be weakened in a number of basic ways. And we want to weaken harmonies in the tonic area. We want to start with that strong 1 chord, and then we want to create a weakening, because that weakening allows the piece to move forward. And then when we finally come back to that strong 5/1 cadence, we're like, aha, stable chords, this is the end of the piece, it feels complete. So a few ways you can do it. You can place your chords on weak beats. So you can place a 5, a 4, 2, or a 6 on a weak beat. You typically maybe want to avoid placing them on strong beats because those strong beats are so powerful. You can also use inversions. Inversions will weaken the sound of any chord. Anytime you have a chord that's in root position, where they're stacked in thirds, it creates a very strong resonance, and that's mostly because of the overtone series. When you use inversions, all of a sudden that relationship is obscured a little bit, and they don't sound as strong, so they sound weaker. You can also add bassline embellishing tones between 2 tonic triads, or embellishing tones between any of the upper voices. Embellishing tones are a great way to sort of obscure the tonic area and keep the piece moving forward. You can use a dominant chord as a pickup to the tonal area. So this is what I was talking about earlier. I'm going to show you an example of this. But you can use the T label on the first beat with a tonic triad and just don't identify the 5 chord in the contextual analysis. So let me show you an example of this. So here we have the 1 chord going up to 5. So here we have a 5 chord, we've got another 1, and a 5 chord. The melody doesn't end on this 5, this 1, or this 5, or even this one here. The melody doesn't really come to a resting point until this 5 chord. So even though you have all these 5 and 1 chords here, these are all serving a non-functional purpose, even though they're technically functional chords. So the only functional chord in here is a 5 and the 1 chord. So they're functional when they serve a function. They're non-functional when they're serving just to expand a tonal area. So typically you've got the 4 or the 2 chords. They normally move to a 5 chord, and that 5 chord is going to start the dominant area. So the 4 and the 2 will actually be predominant chords that may serve as a third part of the phrase model, or actually a fourth, where you have a predominant that comes right before the dominant. So they may be used solely to add interest, and color is an expansion of a harmonic area, so most commonly the tonic area. So if you see a 4 or a 2, you're probably not going to see it anywhere other than the tonic area, or if it's being used functionally as a predominant chord to lead into the dominant. So we're going to show you some examples of this as we go on, but right now I just want to introduce this concept. 5 is normally used as a first chord in a cadence in the dominant area, but it may be used in the tonic area to add interest and expand the area, such as what I showed you in that Bach chorale. Those 5 and 1 chords weren't functional in the middle of the phrase because they were not bringing the piece to a close. So what we can learn from this is that chord choice may help define a composer's personal style. You may see that Bach likes to use a lot of 6/4 chords in the tonal areas. Or maybe Mozart prefers to use more stable chords, likes to use 4 chords and 2 chords. So you can start to get an idea for Beethoven likes to do this, Mozart likes to do this, and you can get sort of a better understanding of what makes their music somewhat unique harmonically. Chord choice can also help identify changing musical styles and periods. So if you know that a classical piece ends with a 5-1 and it's always a strong conclusive 5-1 with 1 in the soprano, 5-1 motion in the bass, then you know that that could very well be a classical period piece. If you see a lot of weird chord successions, so you see a 1 chord, moving to a 2, moving to a 3, moving to a 4, moving to a 5, that would very rarely happen in the classical period unless it's part of a particular device we'll talk about later. And that would indicate that maybe the musical style you're looking at isn't classical. Maybe it's more modern because they are using what we call a chord succession rather than a chord progression. So all these topics are things we're going to get into later, but the important takeaway from this lecture, you need to know the 4 basic tonal areas that we have. We've got the tonic area, that starts the piece. It carries along, and then right before the cadence, often there's a predominant chord. That predominant can be a 4 chord or it can be a 2 chord. And then we hit the dominant chord. And at this point, we're getting ready for that cadence because that dominant chord is going to fall into a tonic. So the dominant chord can be either a 5 chord or it can use a substitute. It can be a 7 chord. So that's something new you've learned here. Up until now, I've only showed you phrases with a 5 chord, but you can also have a leading tone chord. So in the key of C, that would be a B diminished triad. And then that dominant area will fall into a tonic closure, typically. So you'll have a 1 chord there. Sometimes that tonic closure is not given, and then you have what we would call a half cadence because the phrase would end on the dominant. Typically, though, when you end on the dominant and you don't have a tonic closure, eventually the composer is going to bring that tonic closure back for you. So next time we'll be talking about basic cadences and voice leading. And once you start to get more information, a lot of this will become a little less confusing. If you're confused right now, doesn't really surprise me. As we continue to add more information, I'm going to continue to reinforce these previous concepts, and a lot of this stuff will start to become more clear to you.